Only 6 months, 3 days, and 1,200 miles removed from the infamous UFO crash at Roswell, New Mexico. On January 7th, 1948, something tragic happened in the skies over Franklin County, Kentucky that would change the face of ufology forever. At 2:30 in the afternoon, after repeated and coinciding reports around the region of a massive white circular object overhead, 25-year-old Kentucky Air National Guardsman Thomas F. Mantell was dispatched to observe the unknown craft and report back to Godman Army Airfield at Fort Knox. Around 3:15, Captain Mantell's P-15 Mustang would come crashing down into the Franklin County bluegrass below, ending the pilot's life. What happened over the course of less than an hour on that January day early in 1948 would redefine the golden age of the flying saucer phenomena and introduce a terrifying element of danger into the mystery that had come before. Tonight, on our first episode of 2021, and in commemoration of the 73rd anniversary of the unexplained and tragic death of Captain Mantell, we examine the series of events that led up to the crash, as well as the possible cover-up that began even before Mantell's P-51 hit the ground. So keep a check on your altimeters, Nightowls. Tonight we're flying high into unknown skies with all that and more on Midnight in Kentucky. The tragic tale of Captain Thomas F. Mantell.
Welcome to Kentucky.
The birthplace of Abraham Lincoln and built on the largest cave system in the known world. The home of Daniel Boone, Hunter S. Thompson, horse racing, and bourbon.
But when the hour grows late, the bluegrass state becomes the breeding ground for realms beyond those familiar to the human race. In the east, ghosts, spirits, and ethereal entities roam the hills and hollers.
In the north, Mothman beats his wings along the banks of the Ohio River.
To the west, small green creatures stalk farmhouses and disappear without a trace when shot.
While in the south, the energy of the veiled witch is palpable just over the border. Joining with us as we investigate just what goes wrong in the bluegrass night.
And ask the question, how many coincidences are too many? There's no need to check the clock.
There's no need to check the clock. Time is an illusion.
Time is an illusion.
And it's midnight.
It's midnight. In Kentucky.
In Kentucky.
In Kentucky. In Kentucky. In Kentucky. In Kentucky.
Ladies and gentlemen, the full moon has risen and it is the midnight hour. For Midnight in Kentucky, I'm Ben.
I'm Steven.
Welcome back to Midnight in Kentucky, Nightowls, and follow us as always on social media. We are on
Twitter,
Facebook,
midnightinkentucky.com,
YouTube, and of course that YouTube is our Ransom Letter Publishing YouTube. But tonight, to get us started back into all of this bluegrass weirdness, we are looking at one of the seminal UFO cases here in the bluegrass, and there's several seminal UFO cases here in the bluegrass. Tonight, we are talking about the mysterious case of Captain Thomas F. Mantell, a fighter pilot who was supposedly shot down by a UFO over Franklin County, Kentucky on January 7th, 1948. Steven, I think it was originally you who brought my attention to this case way back in the day.
Yeah, I forget what it was. Maybe I found it in Martin Noonley's book, or possibly just researching it on the internet, and I ran across this UFO story that seems to be well known, where, this fighter pilot, Captain Mantell, they spotted a UFO in the area and he took off, they're from Fort Knox and chased it. And I think even one part of the story, like his radio communications, he mentioned right before he crashed that it was something along the lines of, my God, there's people inside this thing. And then he, of course, loses communication. That's where he crashed there in Franklin. But there's a lot to look at here. And this is kind of one of the, actually, I think it's the only fighter jet that we lost to a UFO. I think that's mentioned in a few documentaries and UFO shows once you start, watching them and listening for this exact event. And I don't think they maybe mentioned that, where it was at in Kentucky, or even if it was in Kentucky. I think maybe Fort Knox is mentioned, and that's about it. But, there's a lot to this story.
There really is. There is quite a bit to the story once you actually start digging into it. On the surface, it just seems like, maybe this fighter jet was shot down by a UFO, which is enough. I mean, that's enough. Or fighter plane, Mustang, a P-51. He was flying a P-51. But as you mentioned, though, I do believe this was the first member of the Kentucky Air National Guard to die in flight. So, that's interesting, especially with the fact that it was from a UFO. What's more interesting is what takes place after this case, as was kind of common with cases like these. And I guess it's still common with modern day cases. But there is so much stuff that takes place after this case, and with the investigation itself, and maybe a cover up of what actually did happen to Captain Mantell. That you're right. There is a quite of abundance of information to this case, and it gets weirder and weirder the deeper you dig into it.
Yeah, like we've said many times before, with these type of events, there's always seems to be some type of authority intervention that tries to cover it up or explain away what's happened with just silly explanations. And, we'll get into that later, but, that's usually the case. They just try to, pull one over on people's intelligence.
And, it's worth noting before we get into the actual story that this case does occur on January 7th, 1948, within the first 7 days of 1948, just months in the future from the Roswell incident and Kenneth Arnold's sighting over Mount Rainier, both of which are, commonly thought of as the first major ufological events in the modern era of ufology. This event occurs within, 6 to 8 months of both those events. So, this was still a fresh time for ufology. This was still an odd time for ufology when a lot of different events were occurring and a lot of different strange things were happening, many of which, are major UFO events that are overshadowed by events like Roswell and things. Many of which are strange happenings of professional pilots and professional, just professional people seeing something that cannot be explained.
Yeah. And I think, this case here has kind of lived on for many decades and will continue to live on. It's just another example of pilots having an interaction with, something that's unknown. And still to this day, no one can really fully explain what happened on that day in January.
The tragic and strange events that led to the death of Captain Thomas F. Mantell began at 1:20 p.m. on the afternoon of January 7th, 1948, with a phone call to Technical Sergeant Quentin Blackwell, field tower operator at Godman Army Airfield in Fort Knox, Kentucky, for military police on the base, passing on an alert from the Kentucky State Highway Patrol. Reports of an unknown object in the sky were coming in from 80 miles east of Godman in Maysville, Kentucky. With nothing appearing on radar, Blackwell immediately phoned Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, who informed the sergeant that they were not flying anything in the area of the reports. By the time Blackwell had finished the call, however, Highway Patrol was on the line again, reporting that the craft was now being seen over Owensboro and Irvington, Kentucky, drawing closer to Godman. Witnesses were describing a gigantic white circular object some 250 to 300 feet in diameter with a red light at the bottom, moving at a quick and steady pace to the southwest. At Clinton County Army Airfield, witnesses observed the object for around 35 minutes and described it as having the appearance of a flaming red cone, trailing a gaseous mist. The entire Ohio Valley area had been under an ongoing UFO flap at the time, with sightings of various craft having been reported in Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, and Illinois in the days leading up to and after the incident. At 1:45, Sergeant Blackwell saw the object for himself, through binoculars, from his control tower at Godman Army Airfield. From the tower, it appeared to Blackwell as only a small bright point on the southern sky. Two others, including Base Commander Colonel Guy Hicks, lay witness to the object alongside Blackwell and added additional details to his description. Colonel Hicks described the craft as having something of an umbrella-like shape and being very white, about 1/4 the size of the moon. Continuing, he said, through binoculars it appeared to have a red border at the bottom. It remained stationary seemingly for 1.5 hours. At 2:30, 4 P-51 Mustangs from the 165th Fighter Squadron of the Kentucky Air National Guard approached Godman Field from the south, returning to Standiford Field in Louisville, being led by Captain Thomas F. Mantell. Mantell was a warrior pilot at heart, who at 25 years old was a highly decorated World War II flyboy with over 2,000 hours flight time, more than 100 of which was earned in combat in the skies above North Africa, Europe, and Normandy during the D-Day invasion only 4 years before. Sergeant Blackwell radioed the fighters, asking if they had the fuel to take a look at the unknown object that lay just on the horizon for the Mustangs and beyond the sight of the Godman control towers. Telling Blackwell they could check it out if given the correct heading, Mantell and the other two fighters flew in the direction of the unknown craft, as the 4th P-51, low on fuel, continued on to Standiford Field. Gaining altitude and speed in pursuit of the coordinates, the group climbed to 15,000 feet, whereupon Mantell radioed Blackwell and the Godman control tower, once more telling them,
"The object is directly ahead and above me now, moving at about half my speed. It appears to be a metallic object or possibly reflection of the sun from a metallic object, and it is of tremendous size. I'm still climbing. I'm trying to close in for a better look."
Making a hard right and quickly gaining altitude, the pilots following Mantell were struggling to keep up with the erratic chase playing out before them. Reaching 22,000 feet, the pilots radioed flight leader Mantell to let him know that they were abandoning the interception due to breathing apparatus malfunctions on one of the planes and the requirement that oxygen be used by pilots flying over 14,000 feet. Mantell did not acknowledge the transmission, and at 3:10 was left alone, pushing past 22,500 feet, pursuing the unknown object that he had described as metallic, and traveling at speeds exceeding 180 miles per hour. Flight transcripts have Mantell radioing Godman and speaking with Sergeant Blackwell for a final time, saying he was climbing to 25,000 feet, and if he were unable to intercept, would break off the chase. Sadly, this is not the way this story ends. Moments later, independent witnesses around Kentucky watched as Captain Mantell's P-51 fell from the sky. Many reported hearing Captain Mantell's aircraft explode twice before crashing. Carrie Phillips of Simpson County says she heard an explosion and quickly ran to her window to see the plane collide into a field only 250 yards from her home. W.C. Mays of Franklin, Kentucky describes hearing a sound like a plane diving down and pulling up. Looking up and into the distance, Mays found his theory correct, and that there was a small plane circling around and around in the sky. Suddenly, the plane went into a rotating power dive, creating a terrible humming noise as it fell. Mays said it seemed to explode about halfway to the ground, though he could see no fire. The final description of the unexplained craft that Mantell had crashed in pursuit of came from Godman Army Airfield in Ohio, reporting, "Just before leaving, it came very near to the ground, staying down for about 10 seconds, then climbed at a very fast rate back to its original altitude of 10,000 feet, leveling off and disappearing into the overcast heading at 120 degrees. Its speed was greater than 500 miles per hour in level flight." Around 5 p.m., Mantell's body was rushed to nearby Roker Funeral Home by ambulance. A local firefighter had come forward to report that he had pulled Mantell's decapitated corpse from the wreckage of the P-51 and that the captain's wristwatch had stopped at 3:18. The coroner confirmed this as the time of the captain's death, but released no statement on the condition of the body. Kentucky Air National Guard historian John Tobridge makes note of what he calls a strange X-Files twist regarding the location of the crash. Though Mantell had been born in Franklin County Hospital, his parents had left the following day and he had lived most of his life in Louisville, making the captain one of the few people to be born and die in the same town, but never to have lived there. It has been said by those close to the incident in the years since its occurrence that there had been a standing order passed down from some shadowy authority that no one was to view the body following its retrieval. This is consistent with the fact that no official report on the condition of Captain Mantell's corpse has ever been released, and that there is still some disagreement as to its state after the crash, or, according to some theorists, if there was ever even a body found at all. This interesting rumor is one of many signs that a cover-up of the events that had transpired over Kentucky on January 7th, 1948, may have been enacted even before Captain Mantell's Mustang crashed into the cold Franklin County ground. Officially, Project Sign, the first Air Force project devoted to studying accounts of UFOs, under the pressure of mounting media queries, declared that Captain Mantell had died chasing the planet Venus. It was noted ufologist, professor, and astronomer Dr. J. Allen Hynek who provided Sign investigators with the Venus explanation. By the time the case had been reopened in 1952, however, Hynek had determined the theory incorrect, due to the overcast skies on the day of the incident preventing visibility of anything beyond the immediate atmosphere. Additionally, Hynek had come to believe that the descriptions of the witnesses were inconsistent with how the planet would have appeared. United States Air Force Captain Edward Ruppelt was in charge of investigating the incident when Project Sign's predecessor, Project Blue Book, took a second look 4 years later. Ruppelt concluded that a possible explanation for the craft could have been the Navy's secret skyhook weather balloon. Though this project was said to have been operated from the Clinton County Army Airfield, no official documentation has been found that can confirm this. Reports of the UFO from Clinton County Army Airfield on the day of the incident would also seem to refute the theory that the object was nothing more than a weather balloon launched from the base itself. Additionally, Air Force investigators have also claimed Mantell's P-51 had disintegrated on impact, but this was also cast into doubt by several different testimonies of both men on the ground that day and the findings of researchers years later. As documented in Barton Noonley's incredible compendium of Kentucky oddities, Mysterious Kentucky, one of the most damning pieces of contradictory evidence was presented by author Timothy Good some 50 years after the incident. Good had made the discovery of a series of photos that seemingly showed Mantell's aircraft mostly intact, including the fuselage and wings. These photos only amplified the testimony of former U.S. Army Air Corps Captain James Dusler, who had been called out to investigate the crash, but only after 12 hours had passed and Captain Mantell's body had been removed. When Dusler arrived at 3 a.m. on the morning of January 8th, he found the plane largely intact, though he noted it was filled with thousands of tiny perforations that he was unable to explain. 50 years later, he would describe it to Timothy Good as looking as though it had belly flopped into its current position, leaving the surrounding foliage mostly unharmed. He puts it very plainly in a quote from the interview conducted between himself and Good. The damage report was not consistent with an aircraft of this type crashing into the ground. The official report said that Mantell had blacked out due to a lack of oxygen. This may have well been the case, but the aircraft came down in a strange way. I must admit that I found all of this rather strange. Furthermore, Dusler says he was informed by personnel on the scene that Mantell's body had been whole when it had been removed from the wreckage, negating the earlier report by the fireman that had said he himself had removed the captain's corpse and that Mantell had been decapitated in the crash. Dusler went on to find no sign of blood in the cockpit, further casting the original claims about the nature of Mantell's body into question. Moreover, he was told that there were no cuts of any kind on Mantell, though every bone in the body seemed to have been not only broken, but completely destroyed. Aviator, author, member of Project Blue Book, and leading ufologist in the early days of the study, Major Donald Kehoe, contended, until his death in 1988, that the United States government was withholding information on the Mantell incident from the public and actively working to cover up the affair. Kehoe felt as though the craft seen by Mantell and others on the ground that day must have been enormous in size, and possibly the largest to have ever entered the Earth's atmosphere. Kehoe was so impressed with this case that he believed its solution may hold the key to the entire UFO phenomena. In speaking with an anonymous fellow pilot on the matter, Kehoe reports being told, "It looks like a cover-up to me. I think Mantell did just what he said he would, close in on the thing. I think he either collided with it or, more than likely, they knocked him out of the air." This line of thinking has been shared by many researchers over the years, with many different investigators of the incident proclaiming Mantell's death had been at the hand of an alien death ray, fired from the object he was pursuing when the captain seemingly got too close. The proponents of the death ray theory point to the thousands of tiny perforations in the P-51's fuselage and the condition of Mantell's body itself as evidence of their claim. Though this may seem far-fetched, further reports from on-the-ground witnesses that day do seem to somewhat substantiate the possibility that Mantell was shot down by an unknown craft. Richard T. Miller was stationed at Scott Army Airfield in Bellevue, Illinois, on the day that Mantell died, and had been following the ongoing communications between the captain in pursuit of the unidentified object and Sergeant Blackwell at Godman Field. Not only did this make a believer out of Miller, but he claims that the following morning a briefing was held in which investigators plainly told those gathered that Mantell had died while attempting to observe and apprehend an intelligently controlled aircraft of unknown origin. However, by that evening, Miller says that Air Technical Intelligence Center officers from Wright-Patterson Air Base had arrived and contradicted the Air Force's morning admission that something strange had indeed happened in regard to Captain Mantell's death. Miller says the officers demanded any materials regarding the crash be turned over to them immediately and declared the investigation complete. Miller also believes that the official transcript of the event has been redacted and altered to fit the narrative that a case of mistaken identity on Mantell's part of what he was chasing had cost him his life. He claims that there are a variety of statements that were cut from the official transcript that would paint the incident in a far more terrifying light if they were to be released from their secrecy. The parts of the transmission that have been removed include what Miller says are the last words Mantell would ever utter to another human being. That final, simple, but absolutely horrifying statement was heard plainly over the radio by Miller himself, being told to Sergeant Blackwell by Captain Mantell only moments before his death.
"My God,"
exclaimed Mantell.
"I can see people in this thing."
So there we have it. The mysterious death of Captain Thomas F. Mantell to what is more than likely, to me, what was absolutely an unidentified flying object, but what is much stranger than a skyhook balloon or the planet Venus to me. But what's your opinions on this? There's so much to unpack here. There's so much stuff here.
Yeah. There was a lot to unpack here, but I'll start off saying the Venus explanation and then the skyhook balloon is just absurd. And one thing is, our United States government, I know it may have been in the late 40s when this occurred, but they just don't let any curmudgeon, fly these things. These are intelligent people back then as they are today. They just don't let anybody in these planes. This is a pilot who flew in, World War II and helped take out the Nazis in Germany at Normandy, and to insult his intelligence and his decision making by just saying, "Oh, it was the planet Venus," is just insane. And it's not only insulting to the pilot, Captain Mantell, but it's also insulting to the very agencies that's insinuating that. But I do have to say, that he was on to something. He's pursuing something. It wasn't no weather balloon, or definitely wasn't the planet Venus. In my opinion, the two other pilots backed off of pursuing. I'm assuming maybe they may not have been as experienced, or maybe not as brave, as this pilot was. But he pursued something, and as as I said earlier, and then you when you read it about, he got close enough to radio to the tower and say, "My God, there's people inside this thing." So he's seen something, and then at that point, he either had some type of plane malfunction that made him crash, or he was shot down by this UFO. So what do you think about it, Ben? What's your opinions?
Well, so I think the fact that it occurs on January 7th, 1948 can't be overlooked. Like we mentioned at the beginning of the show, that's only a few months after the supposed crash at Roswell, the Kenneth Arnold sighting, which, launched the modern wave of ufology and the modern history of ufology. Of course, there were sightings before all of these things, and major waves, major flaps, but the way that modern culture has come to think of UFOs really began in 1947 with those encounters. Not only those two, but we also have the Murray Island incident in June of 1947, which I won't go into too deep, but another crazy incident of UFOs maybe hovering over the waters and dripping metals into these waters. And supposedly another aircraft crash that killed some investigators that were involved in this Murray Island incident. So that occurred, in June of 1947, right there with the Kenneth Arnold sighting, which occurred on the 24th of June in 47. And then, Roswell crash, which occurred, supposedly in July of 47. So this incident, the Captain Mantell incident, occurs within 8 months of these major incidents in ufology. And it's interesting, initially this case, like you mentioned, this case looks like a very kind of open and shut case, but there's a lot to unpack here. There's so much to unpack here. There's a cover up, just like at Roswell, just like at Murray Island, just like with the Kenneth Arnold thing. We start seeing these dubious agencies move in to lock this thing down and make sure that all the facts aren't known. And there's a lot of tiny circumstances with this. His wristwatch, the accounts from everybody else at all these different airfields. There's a lot of things with this.
Yeah, and one part of that shocks me, but not really, is that one Air Force base keeps on coming up in all these stories, and that's Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And the significance there is, that's where they supposedly or allegedly took the Roswell wreckage to. And then, they send investigators down on this one just a few months later, around a half a year later, to investigate this, incident and this, possible, downing of one of their jets, or not jets, but, fighter jets, I guess, from their skies. So, I mean, they keep coming up, and they always have this kind of like a lore, in this type of, UFO discussions. But, I just find it interesting they just keep showing up at these incidents.
Absolutely. I mean, at one point, Wright-Patterson was considered, the Area 51 of the East. And I don't know that that's true anymore. I think a lot of stuff has been moved around bases and maybe even off planet, as crazy as that may sound. But, it makes you wonder what all has went on at Wright-Patterson over the years, because you're right. We hear about Wright-Patterson with Roswell. We hear about Wright-Patterson with this encounter. We hear about Wright-Patterson quite a bit in these early UFO encounters.
Right. And I would say, it seems to me, that whatever was taken there from Roswell, when this event happened, just a little bit south here in Kentucky, they possibly was wondering if it, I'm assuming they thought it was the same thing, the way it seems. And then, same thing with Roswell, is just the same tired excuse of a weather balloon.
Absolutely. I mean, and it seems like that's a major recurring thing in these early cases. Dude, there's even a major synchronicity with Roswell here. We have Richard T. Miller, who was working in the operations room at the Scott Air Force Base in Bellevue, Illinois, who is the one who says that Mantell clearly stated, "My God, I see people in this thing." But at a briefing the next morning, he's told by investigators that Mantell had died pursuing an intelligently controlled unidentified flying object. That evening, some people show up from Wright-Patterson, order all the personnel immediately turn over all the materials relating to the crash, and that the investigation was already done. Soon thereafter, it comes out that it was Venus and a weather balloon. So, but right there, that's a synchronicity with Roswell. The very same thing supposedly happened. Jesse Marcel supposedly heard that, or supposedly knew that these were UFO parts. And then, he thinks that the Air Force is going to come out and make this announcement. Instead, these guys come in that have these weather balloon parts, take photos of these weather balloon parts, and he's expected to shut up about it, which he does until I believe he come out on his deathbed maybe and talked about these things. I'm not totally sure about that, but there are definitely some parallels between this case and Roswell in that respect. The fact that, initially investigators are saying this was a UFO, and it seems like a lot of these early UFO cases, investigators aren't sure how to handle it. When the Air Force starts first stepping in to investigate these things, like with Roswell and with Murray Island and with this event, it seems like investigators aren't exactly sure how to handle these things. So, initially they're like, oh, well, this is their findings. This is what it is. And then somebody else stepped in and was like, look, you can't find this. This is not what happened, and you can't say it is. So they quickly backtrack and say it was a weather balloon or the planet Venus or something.
Right. And another thing I think I've seen about this is they're saying, well, he was in, this type of jet, which I think is like a P-51 or a P-52, and he didn't have really that experience in that. But even with that said, that may have attributed maybe to the crash, but that doesn't explain what he's seen and what he was talking about over the radio. To me, you just don't say, hey, I see people in this weather balloon, or I see people in Venus. How is that even possible for a pilot to even describe something in that manner and it be a weather balloon or the planet Venus, which both those explanations is just absurd, as I said earlier.
And that explanation, Venus and swamp gas, Venus is seen through swamp gas, and weather balloons, that's kind of become a cliche at this point, for those early explanations for UFO sightings. It's all, it's almost like that's become like a joke at this point, because people have realized how ignorant that sounds. And, I'm not saying that Venus couldn't be misidentified as, I've done it myself before I really understood the layout of the sky at night. It's a bright star. It looks like UFO, but that was when I was a very young child. And there's no way that a pilot who had been through World War II and had been decorated for going through Normandy, you're right. I just don't buy that he nor any of these people, these decorated people at these air towers, that they saw this thing and misattributed it as the planet Venus. And not only that, but there's the report from Godman Army Airfield in Ohio where, he says just before leaving, it comes very near to the ground and staying down for about 10 seconds, then climbed at a very fast rate back to the original altitude of 10,000 feet, leveling off and disappearing into the overcast, heading 120 degrees. Its speed was greater than 500 miles per hour in level flight. that certainly does not sound like the planet Venus to me. You know what I mean? Like that sounds unlike any terrestrial object or weather balloon. That doesn't sound like something a planet can do. It sounds like this thing was pretty close to the ground in Ohio and then shot off before Mantell intercepted it and took off after it, and it ascended to, heights that his plane was incapable of.
Right. And a weather balloon cannot fly at those speeds. At least I'm not familiar with weather balloons, but I tend to believe that they don't have the capabilities greater than the fighter jets we had back then. And I guess, another thing that I wonder that's not really documented is, was this still on radar after, Captain Mantell crashed? Where did this thing go to? I mean, if it's a weather balloon, you would think it would still be on the radar. And another thing, the planet Venus, to my assumption, would not show up on radar.
That's a very good point, and it showed up on radar. Yeah, that's a very, very good point. In addition to that, the fact that, this thing was not only seen by Captain Mantell, but by several people in several different air towers, one of which, in Ohio, saw it very close to the ground. The events that occur after Mantell's death, and in conjunction with Mantell's death, the fact that his clock is stopped at 3:18, the fact that this firefighter supposedly comes forward and has removed, the half decapitated body of Captain Mantell, the fact that the funeral coordinator says, he confirms that his clock is stopped at 3:18. Would a airplane crash stop a clock? Are you moving so fast that it stops your watch? But then there are additional details added. There's the fact that the Air Force investigator wasn't even allowed in until 12 hours after the body was removed from the wreckage. And supposedly the plane had all these little holes in it. Supposedly, Mantell's body had been intact, but all his bones had been broken. There's very much something to be said here about the fact that the investigation wasn't allowed to proceed like it was supposed to have proceeded after Mantell's plane had crashed.
Right. And what I'm kind of wondering, where is this wreckage at? Where did it go to? What did they do with it? Did they dispose of it? Did they melt it down? Is it still somewhere in a warehouse, somewhere out in the desert, or up in Ohio somewhere?
Right. And not only that, but, so there's this other investigator, Timothy Good, that says that he has original photos of the crash, where large portions of Mantell's aircraft, including the fuselage and the wings, are still intact after the crash, completely going against the original statement that the plane had been disintegrated. And I've seen these photos. It looks like the main fuselage is completely intact. And it does look like there are tiny holes. If I can find it again, I'll include it in the show notes. But it does look like there are many tiny holes in this thing, like it was maybe shot down by something. And, all of these rumors going around about Captain Mantell and following his death, of course, there are going to be rumors going around. It's an airplane crash supposedly caused by a UFO. But as you and I have talked about before, in every lie, there's aspects of truth. People were saying that his body was bullet ridden. Well, what if it wasn't his body that was bullet ridden? What if it was his plane and it wasn't bullet ridden, but it was ridden with these tiny holes caused by whatever this craft did to his plane?
Yeah, and that's just a good example of, most usually when we get these reports and the government intervenes, or whoever intervenes, authorities of some type, we get a little bit of truth sprinkled in with the cover-up story. And yeah, I mean, if there are holes in this plane, they didn't come from the planet Venus, they didn't come from crashing to the ground. Those appeared somewhere, and they probably contributed to the crash itself.
Right. And how is this plane even intact after it's dropped from 30,000 feet? I mean, especially a plane of this era. It doesn't seem like that plane should be intact at all. It seems like it would have split apart. And, and then there's also the witness that claims that she saw it explode twice before it hit the ground. What happened there? Why was the plane exploding if Captain Mantell had just passed out from hypoxia? There's a lot of interesting, things with eyewitnesses and with later reports in this case that indicate that the official thing is not telling the truth.
Yeah, most certainly. There's definitely some cover up here, which, part of it is, yes, this was a, government fighter jet, from our military, and they may not release all the details, but, what makes people more curious is, they offer these, silly explanations like Venus, weather balloon, and then, but there's witnesses that seen this jet explode, not when it hit the ground, but in midair and then crash and explode, but then it's still intact, and there's just a lot of conflict in information.
Right. And I mean, as there is with many of these early UFO cases in early ufology, there's a lot of witnesses that have come forward in the time since then, some even at the time, that have said, hold up, this isn't how this happened. I remember seeing this, very much very similar to the way that with the Calvin Parker, with the Pascagoula incident, years later, there are witnesses coming forward saying they saw that UFO. It seems in this case, there are many witnesses that have come forward to say, I saw something different than what the original report, the official report, said happened. And some of those are even, investigated. Some of those are even official Air Force investigators. Major Donald Kehoe, who worked on Project Blue Book, said that he highly doubted the official explanation that Mantell passed out due to lack of oxygen, and he thought it was a cover-up. He not only said that, but he said that not only was the U.S. government withholding information, but they had chosen to cover up actual facts concerning the case, and that he thought that this case may hold the key to all UFO phenomena. And he says that he basically says that there's no way that these decorated fighter pilots could have misrecognized the planet Venus for this massive alien spaceship. But what do you think that means? The fact that this case could hold the key to all the modern UFO phenomena. What do you think he's talking about there?
There's several things that I could think there. One is that, maybe we could examine, Captain Mantell's jet that went down and examine what took it down, very thoroughly. But another thing that just kind of crossed my mind while we was discussing this is, that, the witnesses seen two explosions, but what if, one of them was Captain Mantell's, aircraft, and the other one was this UFO that he was chasing?
That's a very good point. That's a very, very good point. It is mentioned in Mysterious Kentucky that maybe the Roswell craft was shot down by the United States government, and maybe that they had a campaign of trying to shoot these crafts down. Of course, we know, in World War II, there was the Battle of Los Angeles, where one of these craft supposedly appeared over Los Angeles, and the Army fired at it for hours. So we obviously do know that there is a precedence for these things being fired upon. Maybe you're right. Maybe the craft crashed somewhere and it was brought down by something, or maybe they shot it down in conjunction with the Captain Mantell sighting. And maybe that's why Kehoe says that, this is the key. Ironically, Kehoe says that this is the key to the entire UFO phenomena. There's also something else, which I want to get to here in just a little bit, that ties in with all of that as well. But let's go on and discuss. There are two other major UFO encounters that mirror this one in a lot of ways in 1948. Captain Edward J. Rumpelt wrote in the Report on Unidentified Flying Objects that the Captain Mantell incident was one of three classic UFO incidents in 1948 that Project Sign, the predecessor to Project Blue Book, said proved to Air Force intelligence specialists that the UFOs were real. These included the Chiles Whitted UFO encounter. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I'm probably not. As well as the Gorman dogfight. Now, the Chili's Witted UFO encounter is a pretty impressive event. This is an event that occurred on July 24th, 1948, when two pilots over Alabama come very close to a UFO in a commercial airline. Both of them saw it. But I really want to talk about the Gorman dogfight and how much this case mirrors what happened with Captain Mantell. On the crisp fall night of October 1st, 1948, in Fargo, North Dakota, a town now well known for its quirky strangeness, George F. Gorman, a 25-year-old combat veteran and second lieutenant in the North Dakota Air National Guard, was returning to Fargo's Hector Airport from a cross-country flight with a group of National Guard pilots in his P-51 Mustang. When the planes accompanying Gorman landed around 8:30 p.m., he decided to stay aloft and get in some night flying time due to the evening's clear, cloudless conditions. Around 9, Gorman flew his plane over a lighted football stadium where the North Dakota State Bison were battling it out with the Augusta Vikings in a heated game 5,000 feet below. Preparing to land, Hector Airport Air Traffic Controller L.D. Jensen advised Gorman that a Piper Cub was in the air in his immediate vicinity. Making visual contact with the small plane about 500 feet below his own, Gorman again contacted Jensen at 9:07 to ask if there were any other aircraft in the area other than the Piper Cub and his own P-51. When Jensen informed him that there were not, Gorman told him that he had indeed just witnessed another craft off to the west that appeared as a blinking light. No fuselage or wings could be seen from Gorman's position. The pilot of the Piper Cub, Dr. A.D. Cannon, confirmed that he, along with his passenger, could see the unknown object alight in the western sky when contacted by air traffic control. Informing Jensen that he was going to attempt to apprehend the craft to determine its identity, Gorman pushed his P-51 to full speed, around 400 miles per hour, only barely getting behind the object at 7,000 feet. After having the realization that the craft was moving far too quickly for him to apprehend in a straight run, Gorman attempted to cut it off by making a sharp right turn and approaching the object head-on at 5,000 feet. At the remarkably close distance of 500 feet, the unknown object passed over Gorman's plane, providing him with a clear visual of the object, which he would later describe to investigators by saying, "It was about 6 to 8 inches in diameter, clear white and completely without fuzz at the edges. It was blinking on and off. As I approached it, however, the light suddenly became steady and pulled into a sharp left bank. I thought it was going to make a pass at the tower." Diving down in an attempt not to collide with the unexplainable ball of light, Gorman briefly lost sight of the craft, before again finding it in the sky ahead of him, seemingly having made a full 180-degree turn and heading straight for his P-51. Before a collision between the UFO and Gorman's Mustang, however, the object suddenly shot upward into a vertical climb. Continuing in his attempted apprehension of the craft, Gorman performed his own steep ascension, but at 14,000 feet, his plane stalled with the light still 2,000 feet above him. Though the object would appear to make another pass toward Gorman's fighter, it broke off before getting too close. The second lieutenant attempted twice more to get close with the UFO, with no luck. By this point, however, the object was moving over Hector Airport, where air traffic controller Jensen was observing through binoculars. The pilot of the Piper Cub and his passenger had landed, made their way into the control tower, and were observing the craft as well. Though the three of them could make out the light, no shape or form could be made out from their position. Gorman followed the craft an estimated 25 miles outside of Fargo to the southwest. At 14,000 feet, Gorman spotted the light of the object below him at 11,000 feet, and with his P-51's full power, dived down on the UFO. Seemingly understanding that Gorman had made an aggressive action toward it, the craft shot straight up, making a vertical climb into the atmosphere. Still, Gorman pressed on. The pilot made one further attempt to pursue the object, but instead watched as it passed out of visual range. At 9:27, Gorman broke off the chase and a short time later landed at a Hector airport. Plenty of familiar names from the Mantell incident would come to be involved in the Gorman investigation as well. Members of Project Sign descended on Fargo and Hector Airport almost immediately following Gorman landing. After interviewing Gorman, Jensen, and the Piper Cub pilot and his passenger, investigators initially ruled out any other flying vehicles and had concluded that something remarkable had indeed occurred. Geiger counter readings taken of Gorman's plane showing significantly high radioactivity also contributed to their findings. However, soon, Project Sign would officially backtrack their original ruling on the case and put forth the theory that Gorman had been chasing a weather balloon released by Air Weather Service in Fargo on the morning of October 1st. When the weather balloon had disappeared from sight, said Sign investigators, Gorman had then misidentified the planet Jupiter for a UFO and given chase. Both findings were incredibly similar to those put forward by Sign investigators during the investigation of the Mantell incident, where it was originally decided that the captain had misidentified the planet Venus, and when that was largely rejected, they proclaimed Mantell's UFO to have been an at that time secret U.S. Navy balloon. Just as with the conclusions drawn from Captain Mantell's death, many researchers disagreed with the findings of Project Sign and the later determination that Gorman's UFO was nothing more than a lighted weather balloon by Project Blue Book. Major Donald Kehoe, who also raised questions regarding the official explanation of the Mantell incident, does not agree with Project Sign and later projects' conclusion on the case and continues to treat it as if it were unsolved. Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, who served on Project Blue Book, considered the Gorman encounter, along with the death of Captain Mantell and an additional encounter by commercial pilots in the skies over Montgomery, Alabama in 1948, to be the three cases that proved to Air Force Special Intelligences that UFOs were real. In a statement made to investigators on October 23, 1948, and later widely released, Gorman described the object he was attempting to apprehend and the conditions of his pursuit of the craft. I am convinced that there was definite thought behind its maneuvers. I am further convinced that the object was governed by the laws of inertia because its acceleration was rapid but not immediate, and although it was able to turn fairly tight at considerable speed, it still followed a natural curve. When I attempted to turn with the object, I blacked out temporarily due to excessive speed. I am in fairly good physical condition, and I do not believe that there are many, if any, pilots who could withstand the turn and speed affected by the object and remain conscious. The object was not only able to outturn and outspeed my aircraft, but was able to attain a far steeper climb and was able to maintain a constant rate of climb in excess of my aircraft. Though there are various similarities between the Gorman dogfight and the Mantell incident, one of the most glaring differences in the two cases of otherworldly pursuit is, of course, the finale of events. Captain Thomas F. Mantell would go to his grave only 45 minutes after his first encounter with the object that would, at least according to some theorists, bring down his P-51. George Gorman, who passed away in 1982, would go on to achieve the rank of lieutenant colonel and retire from the Air Force. Gorman would have a lifetime to reflect on what happened to him over Fargo on October 1st, 1948, though he would rarely speak of it following the initial investigation. However, according to those who knew him, he was never convinced that he had been dueling with a lighted balloon for 27 minutes. So, there are a ton of similarities between the Gorman dogfight and Captain Mantell's incident. With the exception that George Gorman didn't follow this object. He didn't chase after it. He let it go. He realized that it was flying too far ahead of him, and he returned to the airport. But dude, there are so many synchronicities between what happens with George Gorman on October 1st, 1948, and with what happened to Captain Mantell on January 7th, 1948. It's crazy. Like, it's almost the same story.
Yeah, I mean, they're almost exact the same story, with the exception of the outcome.
Right. I mean, we have George Gorman, flying a cross country flight, just like we had Captain Mantell flying to Standiford Air Force Base with his crew. Captain Mantell is separated from the other two planes that were flying along with him. George Gorman decides to get in some night flying after his ends, so we have that separation of both of them. We have their ages. They're both 25-year-old pilots. Both of them served in World War II, were highly decorated pilots. There's so many synchronicities between what George Gorman went through in Fargo, North Dakota, which again is known for its, weird happenings, its UFO sightings. Of course, the Coen brothers made a movie about how weird Fargo is, and with Fargo, which is now an FX series. Both are fantastic. But there's a history of weirdness in Fargo, just like there's a history of weirdness, in Kentucky. And it seems like these things happen again and again and again and again like this. And they're always with these weird synchronicities, just like with George Gorman and Captain Thomas Mantell.
Yeah, and I even think another, similarity is the plane they were flying. I think they both were flying the same model of jet.
I believe so. I think Gorman's was a P-51 Mustang, and P-51 Mustang, and there's so many synchronicities here between the Gorman dogfight and what happened with Captain Thomas Mantell. And that brings me to my next point in a way, because as I was studying these things, Ryan Sprague of the Somewhere in the Skies podcast, excellent podcaster, happened to post something last night while I was researching about a program that ran parallel to Project Blue Book at the time Project Blue Book was going on. And I haven't got to do a lot of research into it. There honestly doesn't seem to be a lot of research to do into it. So from what I can tell, this program was discovered by Jacques Vallée, who wrote about it in Forbidden Science, and it's called the Pinnacle Project. And again, I haven't got to do a lot of research into this, but the Pinnacle Project supposedly ran alongside Project Blue Book and was a more secretive program that was similar to Blue Book and took a look at these UFO encounters. And, there's some weird stuff with Project Pinnacle. Supposedly, Jacques Vallée found what is called the Pinnacle Memo. And I want to take a deeper dive into this, maybe on a Patreon episode or something like that, because it does seem like this has a lot of interesting information that could apply, to UFOs in general. But this Project Pinnacle, as we mentioned, both the Captain Mantell incident and George Gorman, the Gorman dogfight, were investigated by Project Blue Book, or Project Sign, the predecessor to Blue Book. And it makes you wonder what this alternative program, this Project Pinnacle, this top secret program, has on these cases that Project Blue Book completely left out, so as to appear, like these are much more mundane. It makes you wonder what these top secret programs had on the Mantell incident, on the Gorman dogfight, the strangeness, that may have been omitted for the public's version.
Yeah, I'd say it's a lot more detail, and even stuff that we probably haven't even thought of that's in those documents. And there's probably programs out there that's classified that we don't even know about. I mean, I would say it's probably just limitless of the information that's out there that's just stored somewhere and probably to this day more or less forgotten about.
Right. You're absolutely right. But even to think about that name, Project Pinnacle, which, is pinnacle as in like a summit is the way it's spelled. But, there's also pinnacle, which is like a pentacle, like a pentagram. And it's interesting that, both these incidents occurred, that were very similar, almost identically similar in October of 48. And that they're, one occurs in Kentucky, one occurs in Fargo, North Dakota. And, there is this thing in these Project Pinnacle documents that says something along the lines of you should ensure that demonstrations are made in your area. And Jacques Vallée thinks that, maybe that these documents were, referring to UFO waves. So, I thought that was an interesting thing in the research that I found, and I couldn't not mention it. I need to dig into it more, and I'm sure we'll talk about it on a future show, but I thought that was interesting, and I thought that it was interesting that these cases mirror each other so much, occur in the same year, were both investigated by Project Blue Book, and, now there's this mysterious alternative project that run alongside Blue Book that was known as Project Pinnacle, and supposedly, made sure that there were UFO demonstrations in people's areas for whatever reason.
Yeah, and and with both these cases, it seems like during this time span of just a few years in the late 40s, going into the 1950s, it seems like there were so many of these type of incidents, and then they didn't really stop. I mean, there's still UFO sightings, but actual encounters that's documented stopped. They ceased.
Right. And it makes you wonder if, that it wasn't dulled down, it wasn't watered down by programs like Project Blue Book, when Project Pinnacle was probably the legitimate program that was doing all these weird things and investigating the supreme weirdness of it, and maybe even ensuring that these things are seen by the public for whatever weird reason. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And, I also find it interesting, that we're kind of seeing a mirrored situation today with the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. We've learned, pretty much that not only did that program never end, but there were many programs running alongside of it doing different things in conjunction with UAPs, as they are now known to the government.
Yeah, I mean, and it seems like maybe these programs and disclosures are coming out, now in the last few years. And even, with the sightings by the here recently that the Navy come out with, and, and as we're kind of getting more and more disclosure about these things, I'm hoping there'll be more things that come out and maybe even explain, in more detail what happened to Captain Mantell.
That's the perfect segue for what I wanted to talk about next in regards to this case. There are so many cases that kind of lend themselves to the Captain Mantell case. And there are so many cases that mirror it, not only, with the Gorman dogfight, but think about this, man. It seems like in the Captain Mantell case that we have this massive UFO just hovering over the atmosphere of, the Owensboro, Pennyroyal region, and we hear about this so much from the Stanford abductions. These three women are driving home one night and there's this massive UFO hovering over Liberty, to the dogfight over Louisville, which we talked about last year in our February show, between the Louisville Metro Police helicopter and this little ball of light, like George Gorman describes. We have both of those. We have the James Bunch incident where James, the deputy police officer, shows up at this residence and there's this massive UFO hovering over this house. We have the UFO over Pike County, which is talked about in Hellier, and then, of course, we have the Tic Tac incident, which is almost exactly what Captain Mantell and George Gorman described back in 1948, happening in modern days, seen by Navy pilots. One of the groundbreaking events to these past few years of supposed disclosure that we've been getting. So this incident may have been the first of its kind between a UFO and a terrestrial, flying machine, but it certainly wasn't the last. Even up to the Tic Tac incident with Navy pilots seeing these things. I mean, it's pretty well documented that pilots are seeing these things. Very well trained pilots are seeing these things, and they're seeing them quite a bit.
Yeah, and it seems like since this disclosure's come out, it seems like, people are talking about this more, and these old, events from the 40s and 50s, and on up through the last few decades are coming out more, and more people's, researching and discovering these historic events, and people are asking questions.
Right, absolutely. And, before we summarize these things, before we give our final thoughts on all this, another part that I thought was interesting and rather weird, as the historian for the Kentucky National Guard pointed out, Captain Mantell had lived almost his entire life in Louisville, Kentucky, but had been born in Franklin, Kentucky, where, his plane would eventually crash. And he calls it a weird X-Files twist, but it absolutely is a weird X-Files twist. It's a weird synchronicity in these events, that seem to have so many weird coincidences involved in them already.
Yeah, and chances are when, Captain Mantell was flying over that area and he was, trailing this, craft, I highly doubt that he realized exactly where he was at and where he was crashing at, that he was, where he was born in the community, or in the county of Franklin County, Kentucky.
Right. And, it's kind of like you and I have discussed on earlier episodes about how these events tend to bring people together in a weird way. Even this event, with the marker there in Franklin, it seems like it's one of those things like Roswell, that seems to be that community's like Point Pleasant, that seems to have brought that community together. It seems like, unfortunately, the death of Captain Mantell, the mysteriousness of it, has kind of brought this community together. And it's weird that, that was his birthplace that he hadn't been to, or that he had moved away from where he crashed. And now there's a plaque to his, to his bravery and trying to go after this thing right there in Franklin, Kentucky.
Yeah. And I feel like the decision he made to pursue this craft was definitely brave. He was, inquisitive of wanting to figure out exactly what it was. And, it seems to me if that was like a weather balloon and not another craft, he would have been easily able to catch it and see what it is, or get in within distance of it, saying, okay, yeah, this is some type of weather balloon or something like that, other than saying it's a craft with people inside of it.
Right, exactly. And I mean, man, that is one of the most like creepy aspects of the story, is the fact, that the control tower, I forget his name now, but the guy from the control tower says that, there's a whole part of this that is basically got took from the recording. And in that, right before Mantell was shot down, he says that he sees people in this thing. I can't imagine being in the tower and him saying there were people in this thing, and then, the seeing the plane crash or go down. I mean, that would be absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, and you have to think, people who heard that, what they were thinking, what was going through their mind at that point.
Right, exactly. So let's wrap this thing up. Let's try our best to tie these things in a neat little bow. These things can never be contained in such a manner. What are your final thoughts on this case? It's one of the defining cases of ufology in general. I'm sure that more has been said by better investigators than us many, 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 many times. So, it is what it is. But what are your takeaways from this case? What were your major moments where you were like, yeah, this corresponds with other things that we've heard, or the other major narratives that have been presented with these things?
Yeah, definitely taken away from this is, it has the aspects of all these classic UFO encounters, such as Roswell, what happened there in Fargo. It has, aspects of the agencies covering it up, making excuses, weather balloons, being Venus or whatever it may be. The cool thing about this is, it happened just about an hour west of us, here in Kentucky. It's sad that Captain Mantell lost his life in this. And, he's really the only documented pilot to lose his life pursuing one of these objects in the sky. And hopefully one day we will be able to get more information on this and know the truth. But that's just something we're going to have to keep pursuing.
You're absolutely right with this being one of the predecessors of, or being one of those major founding cases, and the parallels between those early cases. And that was something that, I didn't really notice until we started discussing on the show, even doing research on it and stuff like that. I knew that it was closely followed, or it closely followed Roswell and the Kenneth Arnold sighting and the Murray Island incident. But there are so many parallels between those incidents. It's weird. And it almost shows that in the beginning, or, not the beginning, but in the beginnings of the major modern era of this thing, that governments didn't know how to deal with it. They didn't, some people wanted to come out with it, some people didn't, and ultimately the call was made to just blanket cover it up. And you got to remember, this was an era when it seemed like a lot of people would just accept that blanket covering up until the 60s or 70s, when Roswell started to come back, after a lot of government dissent had happened, and the society's mind had moved away from that patriotism in a way, and I don't even want to call that patriotism, that blind loyalty to America in a way that we seem to have had following and leading into World War II. In the 60s and 70s, that kind of went away, and that's when Roswell came back to the collective memory. That's when all these incidents that, it got wiped under the rug, people started saying, hey, maybe there was something to that. Maybe we were being lied to the whole time. And it definitely seems like with this incident, there was something to it, and it had been covered up. It was being told that it was a weather balloon or Venus or whatever, just like what Roswell was told was a weather balloon or, swamp gas or, whatever the excuse. Or a skyhook, or Project Mogul, another balloon, just like, this case was supposedly said to be a skyhook balloon. Regardless, the Captain Mantell incident, it holds so many parallels to those early UFO incidents that it can't be denied that it's a seminal UFO event in history, along with, several other events here in Kentucky. The Hopkinsville Goblins, several others. So ultimately, I think there was probably something else going on, things that we weren't told. I definitely don't think we were given the official story, given the fact that, even official investigators like the Air Force investigator said that the fuselage was intact. There are photos of the fuselage intact, even though, the official report says that most of the plane was completely disintegrated. It's obvious that that Captain Mantell's body itself was kept secret in strange ways. Exactly what happened to Captain Mantell and exactly how his body was at the time of the crash was kept secret. So, there's a lot of these odd events, just like with Roswell. And not saying that I believe the official Roswell narrative, and not obviously I don't believe the official Roswell narrative. But I don't necessarily believe that it was an alien craft that crashed in Roswell. I don't know what happened in Roswell, just like I don't know what happened here. It definitely seems that Captain Mantell believed that he was chasing after an extraterrestrial craft, or a craft, not of this earth, if anything, not of this reality. From describing it as a giant metallic object to talking, about how, it was moving. The descriptions from the Ohio Air Base definitely doesn't seem like this thing was the planet Venus or a weather balloon to me. And then there's the introduction of this whole alternate program to Project Blue Book, which, I'm hoping again to delve more into in a future episode, because I need to do much more research on this. But it does bring up a whole nother side of these cases that were investigated by Project Blue Book. It makes you wonder if Blue Book wasn't just the public version of what they wanted us to know at the time. And it makes you wonder if these modern programs like ATIB aren't just the public versions of what these people want us to know at the time with what they have. I think that they have come a long way in their knowledge of what the phenomena is at this point. I still don't think that they have it under control. I think they would like us to believe that they have it under control, but I don't think they have it under control. And I think back then there was indecision in authority about whether to come out and say, Captain Mantell died of chasing an unidentified object. Roswell was a crash of an unidentified object. It seems like there was argument between people about whether to come out and tell the truth on those events or to cover them up. And it seems like they reached right there at that point of coming out and saying, we think that Captain Mantell died chasing an unidentified flying object, and saying it was the planet Venus. So there were some definite decisions made in a lot of those original cases of modern ufology about what to say and about what to do. And it makes you wonder, to compare it with what's happening now. It makes you wonder if the same thing's not happening with events very similar to Captain Mantell's, with, the Tic Tac incident. It makes you wonder if those calls aren't being made now about whether to come out with the full truth, which obviously we're not getting, we never have, or to backtrack and say, and maybe we're getting a little more of it these days, at least we're not being told it's Venus, or we're being told that they don't know what it is. We're being told that it's being investigated. But, in a way, is that any different than what Project Sign and what Project Blue Book were doing, in 48 with these guys, and then having an alternative program running alongside of them that's not being reported to the public, that's going into the much weirder side of these things?
Yeah, I feel like there is probably some type of public program, and then there's a real program. And it seems like it's, kind of using the same methodology as they, use for Project Blue Book, of, releasing what they want us to see. And I think they have to kind of admit some of these things just because the technology is here today. We're able to see more, we're able to record more. And I think they have to kind of give us a little bit more of the truth, or spin it, in a way that it seems, okay, we're your friend, we're giving you this information, we're wanting to be more open about this, while at the same time not being open and honest, and just kind of giving us a chiseled down version of the truth.
Right. Absolutely. 100%. That's going to do it for Midnight in Kentucky this evening. Thanks for listening. Thanks so much for being a part of Midnight in Kentucky. We appreciate you guys more than you know. Till the next moon rises, Nightowls, for Midnight in Kentucky, I'm Ben.
I'm Steven.
Good night.
You've been listening to Midnight in Kentucky,
a Ransom Letter Publishing podcast.
Join us on Twitter and Facebook,
or get in contact with your questions, comments, or stories of high strangeness
at midnightinkentuckypodcast@gmail.com.